this isn't the first time I've taught on the topic of Scientology. I've actually taught it one time previous, but that was 9 years ago. That was in 2006. And a lot has happened in the intervening years. In 2006, Tom Cruise was still standing on Oprah Winfrey's couch and shouting things and stuff like that. It's an interesting position to look back now 9 years later and to see what's happened in Scientology. You may kind of think, well, this will be kind of interesting. This will be kind of nice. Maybe I don't know much about Scientology, but this won't be necessarily so practical. I mean, how many Scientologists do you get to witness to out on the streets, right? But you'd be surprised. And my goal for tonight's class is not to take down Scientology per se as it stands, although we're going to spend a lot of our time understanding what they do, because it's important for people to understand just how insidious this business that masquerades as a religion is. But beyond that, what I've been finding as the wheels start to come off the machine is that we are actually prepping our culture for a significant number of people, if not to fall into Scientology, to fall into some kind of cultic system that bears many of the same hallmarks. So this isn't merely to talk about Scientology. This is also to talk about how people fall into a belief system that starts to control them and starts to manipulate them, and what those end results can be. So it's much broader than that, and that's why I hope you'll take it. We're going to start off this evening with our text in 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy 3. And Paul is writing to warn young Timothy of some things that will be coming down the road. He says, "Understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid such people." And I think that's a very telling passage that kind of echoes really what I see in a lot of Scientology. Now, if you turn the page over to 2 Timothy 4, he gives Timothy then the marching orders. You are to avoid those people. What are you to do instead? "I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingdom, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season." And that's what we're doing tonight. We're getting ready. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching, for the time is coming when the people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. "As for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, and do the work of an evangelist. Fulfill your ministry." So you see Paul's painting a pretty broad picture that people will become lovers of money, lovers of self, proud, arrogant, not loving the good, wanting something different, and then they'll want to have their ears tickled. They won't want to deal with the hard reality of truth. They'll want something that is more appeasing to them. And this is what we find in Scientology. So, why study Scientology? Well, first of all, I think that Scientology is a good way to highlight the fact that we live in a feel-good era. We live in a feel-good era today. This is what people want. They want something that, it's almost like affluence breeds ignorance in some senses. We're affluent enough to where we don't have to worry about whether we're going to have another meal. So that doesn't captivate our days. We don't think about mortality so much because we can pop a pill, see a doctor, things like that. It's much more rare than it used to be. Most families, say 150 years ago, they would have lost one or two children as a matter of course. 25% of all pregnancies in the 19th century, would end in the mother's mortality. And so, but that's not what we have today. That's not how we face life today. We've kind of shuffled all of that off, and our modern technology gives us confidence. So we sometimes lose focus on what the big pictures are, and we start to worry about the little things like, does this make me feel happy? Am I being fulfilled here? Not the question of, is this true, but does it satisfy me? Those are two different questions we have to understand. I mean, you've got Anthony Robbins, right? You got the power of positive speaking, things like that. You've got the word faith preachers. Even within Christendom, you see folks coming in trying to say that this God wants you to be your best life now, or what have you, right? So it's all about me. God wants this for me, but it's me that's the focus of my theology. Oprah and such just feed on this, and that's kind of what has made their media empires. So Scientology sits smack dab in the middle of this. This is how it started, and this is how it gained its prominence and its power. It also shows the power of celebrity, because we all know, right? If I ask you to name two famous Scientologists, who are you going to tell me? Right, Tom Cruise and John Travolta. Everybody knows that. They're right off the top of your head. Boom, we know. Why do we know those names so well? Why do we associate them with Scientology so easily? Because Scientology has made it a point to associate those people with its faith, because they were popular stars, and they would attract more people who said, I want to be like that guy. Okay. And so the power of celebrity is, again, something that's driving the individual. Also, Scientology is real. I mean, there are real people who are caught in the web of the Church of Scientology, and it's very, very dangerous. It's not only dangerous to those who adhere to Scientology, but it's dangerous to their friends, to their family, or even to anyone who would dare to criticize it. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And lastly, I think it underscores the danger of relativism in our society. In watching this documentary, Going Clear, one of the gentlemen, Paul Haggis, who is a very famous Oscar-winning director and screenwriter, who worked with Clint Eastwood on the Band of Brothers and things like that. And I think he did $1 Million Baby. I think he directed that. He was a Scientologist for, I think, 27 years, something to that effect. And what he said initially drew him in was, of course, the people were telling him, man, if you check out Scientology, you got to check this out, because they will give you whatever you want, anything you want, you'll be able to achieve through this program. And he goes, well, that sounds pretty good, but I'm a little skeptical. So he sits down, and one of the first things he reads is, quote, from a book in Scientology, and it says, quote, in Scientology, there's no enforced belief. Rather, it is a maxim in Scientology that only those things which you find true for yourself are true. In that regard, Scientology is a voyage of self-discovery. Now, if you've been coming to this class for any length of time, warning flags should have gone off as soon as I would have said, only those things which you find true for yourself are true. And what's wrong with that statement? There's a big fat, like, what? Okay, I think it's true that my bank account has $1 million. Oh, maybe not. Of course, the question is, the statement itself, only those things that you find true for yourself are true. Is that statement true? What if the problem is the statement itself makes too broad of a claim. But this made Scientology very, very attractive to this gentleman and to many others, because what do they think? Oh, I can just discard any of the weird stuff. I've heard some rumblings that there might be some weird stuff, but I can just throw that away, and I can just keep the good stuff for myself. This is part of the reason why we have to understand the entire system of belief in Scientology. And again, the bigger problem is to even hold to that, to think that you can do that, is a kind of relativism that's prevalent in our society today. We think that religion is like a salad bar or a buffet at the local, Shakey's, where you can pick some of this and pick some of that, and, ooh, I don't like any of that green stuff, don't put that on my plate. This is not the way truth works. A worldview has to be consistent internally, and it has to be consistent with the world in which it describes. Scientology is actually neither. I've found Christianity to be both. It requires no amazing discussion or no amazing leaps of logic in order for the internal pieces to fit together, and it tends to accurately reflect what we see in society. Christianity teaches, for example, that men were born with original sin. Okay, so how does that reflect society? You think that's accurate? How many of you have taught your kids to be selfish? No, what do you have to teach them? Not to be selfish. So it's not that we're a blank slate. It's not that we're maximally positive people until these negative emotions crowd into us. We learn the opposite is true. And this is what I mean by worldviews needing to match, be internally coherent and externally referential. So, where do we start with this faith? Well, the best place to start is with the guy who founded it, L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard is an interesting character. He was born March 13th, 1911, to Harry Ross Hubbard and Ladora May Waterbury. His father joined the Navy in 1904, re-enlisted in 1917, and served all the way through World War II, gaining the rank of lieutenant. Now, this had always intrigued Hubbard. I think he's had a lifelong fascination with the Navy and with the idea of commanding ships and things like that, and that really drew him in, and he later wanted to enlist in the Navy himself. In his educational background, Hubbard attended George Washington University, and if you look on the Scientology website and in Scientology publications, they will tell you that Hubbard graduated as a civil engineer focusing on nuclear physics. They also say he earned a PhD from Sequoia University. But it seems that Hubbard was actually a pathological liar, and he's done this most of his life. His academic record shows that he attended George Washington University for only 2 years, was placed on academic probation at that institution. He had failed both physics and calculus. So rather than the hype of him, being a PhD, I don't think he was that good a student. He did, though, because of his father, get to travel a little bit, and he took on some world cultures and understood things. Went to the Far East to visit his dad, who was stationed there while he was in the Navy. And many of the Eastern ideas that kind of tinge Scientology may have found their basis here. Hubbard also had a friend who was very into Aleister Crowley and the occult, and he seemed to pick up some of the occult influences. Some say that he was deeply involved in occultism himself, which may be true. I can't verify that. But if it is, it would be interesting as some of these things that we will find out about Scientology seem to be coming from the pit of hell. And I don't say that lightly. But where Hubbard starts to make his mark is as a pulp fiction writer. Now, I don't know if you understand what pulp fiction was back in those days. In the Depression, people wanted entertainment, couldn't afford a whole lot, so they would sell these little paperback books. But these paperback books were made out of really cheap paper called pulp paper, which is just kind of mashed together recycled paper. And pulp fiction writers were paid a penny a word. That's how they were paid. They weren't paid per book, they were paid per word. So guess what you did? You wrote a lot of words in your books, or you wrote a lot. And Hubbard was prodigious. I think Going Clear claims that he still holds the Guinness Book of World Records for writing the most number of books in like a 10-year span. He would just pound away furiously. Not necessarily that any of them were any good, but the idea is you get paid a penny a word, so you're right. Right? And he did that from 1932 to 1948. His success, I mean, this is still a lot of hard work, but his success really turned around when he started getting published in a science fiction magazine, Astounding Science Fiction. And John Campbell was the publisher of that, and he started engaging in those things And his science fiction writing became very, very prominent in what he would do, and he focused on the science fiction side of life. Now, in World War II, he enlisted, joined the Navy naturally after his father. He had some various desk assignments. He was allowed to command a training vessel that he took out on a couple of runs. I guess he tried to shoot a log. He thought it was an enemy ship and ordered the log to be shot at, and it was log. And then from what I understand, he like bombed a Mexican island or something like that. Anyway, he was relieved of duty fairly quickly after that, never got his full command of a vessel. But the fact that he was a pulp fiction author and that he was had this naval drive in him, these are the two facts that really start to shape the concept of Scientology. What Hubbard started to do then was to, it's pretty common that most people who knew him would say in the late 40s, he was frustrated because he was working so hard, writing all of this pulp fiction I think he was freelancing at the time, or self-employed, they considered it. But he'd have to turn around and, just like this Wednesday, pay taxes on all that stuff that he had earned. So he'd work and work and work, and the government would turn around and take it away. And that was, as you could imagine, very, very frustrating. And he has been rumored to say on more than one occasion that the only way you can make any money in this world is if you start your own religion, because religions are tax exempt, right? So Hubbard decides to turn a corner, and in 1950 he publishes a book called Dianetics. Now many of you have seen the commercials. Dianetics, the modern science of mental health. Yeah, it's about 60, 70 years old now. It was 1948. He was invited to address a science fiction group in Newark, hosted by Sam Moskowitz, who is also a writer. And he said, "Writing for a penny a word is ridiculous. If a man really wants to make $1 million, the best way to do it would be to start his own religion." So he starts talking to Campbell, his publisher from Astounding Science Fiction. And he starts talking about his theories on man's memory, how experiences are recorded, some of his philosophies that he picked up in the East. And he believes that if one were to recall painful events and erase them, it would have beneficial effects on mental and physical health. So in 1950, Hubbard publishes an Astounding Science Fiction article in its May issue that teases this concept. He also publishes Dianetics, the modern science of mental health, so that the people who read the Astounding Science Fiction, his audience, will go out and buy the second book. The book, Dianetics, opens with, quote, "The creation of Dianetics is a milestone for man, comparable to his discovery of fire and superior to his inventions of the wheel and the arch. The hidden source of all psychosomatic ills and human aberration has been discovered, and skills have been developed for their invariable cure." Okay, Hubbard was nothing if not a promoter. He was also quite proud of himself, obviously, to put his discovery right up there with fire and above the wheel and the arch. But this is Dianetics, and the idea of science and health brought together seemed to be attractive. It became actually a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. The American Psychological Association did get a copy of it, read it, couldn't make heads or tails of anything, said, "What is this stuff? This makes no sense whatsoever," and dismissed it, gave it a scathing review, and sales plummeted. Like 2 years later, sales just dropped off because of the review. I think that embittered Hubbard to the psychiatry and psychology professions, and that bitterness stands between Scientology and psychiatry to this day. That those people, a matter of fact, Tom Cruise or any of the Scientologist spokesmen, they said, "Wasn't this kind of pop psychology?" They said, "No, don't put me in that classification. You're insulting me by comparing Scientology with psychology." So that's how they kind of go through. Now Hubbard ran the organization all the way from the 50s. Again, after Dianetics dropped off, he had to kind of reinvent it a second way. And what he did was he reinvented it full-blown as a religion, as opposed to just a book and a technique. he coined the idea of the Church of Scientology and came out with a full-blown religious system or religious order that still implicated or drew upon the main concepts of Dianetics. However, the U.S. government wasn't, one at the 50s to just say, oh yeah, you came up with this in your bedroom, great, here you go. They didn't grant tax-exempt status to it. That frustrated Hubbard more. He wouldn't pay the taxes. Eventually, warrants went out for his arrest. He had to escape the United States. He actually started to put his operations in the 60s and 70s on boats, Navy, right? So he had these ships that would sail through the Mediterranean, and sometimes he would sneak on land and things like that. But this is where he starts a bunch of young recruits, calls themselves the Sea Organization, SEA, the Sea Organization. They all dress in naval kind of attire, and there's ranks and things like that. And this goes on and on, all the way until Hubbard's death in, I think, 1984. 1984. Now, in that point, one of Hubbard's assistants, who was part of what he, and there's all these acronyms in Scientology. This division, this little section, was called the Commodore's Messenger Organization, the CMO. And there was a young kid who was Hubbard's assistant named David Miscavige. And he helped Hubbard shoot promotional videos, and the CMO office was tasked with whatever Hubbard wanted done, they would get done, whether it was clandestine, whether it was illegal, whatever. He would deal with that. And when Hubbard died, Miscavige kind of saw how he didn't leave any instruction for any followers. It's really fascinating. I find this is true with Muhammad as well. And to some degree Joseph Smith, but it's interesting that tyrants and megalomaniacs tend not to believe that they'll ever die, so they never plan for their succession. And usually this kind of thing happens where it shakes people up. And so you have, with Muhammad, you had the fight, and this is where the Sunni and Shia break starts. With Hubbard, there was no plan for succession, so Miscavige was he was in his 20s now, pretty sharp guy, knew the inside workings pretty well, knew how to leverage information he had, eventually became kind of the top man, and in 1987 was promoted to chairman of the board of the Religious Technology Center by the board of directors, which is the Religious Technology Center is the organization that holds all the copyrights to all the Hubbard materials. So they're the ones that get all the money. And so he's basically the leader of Scientology from 1987 to this day. One of the most amazing things that Miscavige did, and most people believe he did it through coercive tactics, is that he got tax-exempt status for the Church of Scientology in 1993. And that was a huge deal because Scientology was facing a $1.5 billion tax debt. And it would have broken the church. There was more money than the church would have had. So if they didn't get tax exemption, because tax exemption for religious organizations are retroactive. It goes back all the way to the beginning. So any donations and things you get, you're exempt from at that point. Simultaneously, what happened was Miscavige filed about 2,400 lawsuits against different IRS officials and leaders all across the country, and then told the chairman of the IRS that all of those will go away if we just get tax exemption. And that's kind of how that happened. Now there's obviously none of this is, the lawsuits are all on record, but the claim isn't. But all of a sudden, the lawsuits were dropped as tax exemption became a fact. Okay, so that's kind of the background of Scientology stemming from Dianetics. But what are the basic beliefs?